Tak. I can say that. Tak and fika. Okay. So, first of all, tak indeed to Mid Sweden University and to the Faculty of Social Sciences and to the Forum for Gender for giving me the honor of being here. I'm very, very, very deeply honored. And of course, it is impossible for me to come and talk about something that is not close to my heart and not close to the work of the Forum for Gender to consider the questions about the voices of girls and young women in social activism. A question that I think preoccupies me, and I have presented this question in at Mid Sweden before, but it's an ongoing question of my work of what would it really mean to study the world from the standpoint of adolescent girls, both as knowers and as actors. And it's the knowers question, I think, is a very important one. In my own country of Canada, we have very high rates of sexual violence, gender violence against girls and young women, both amongst the mainstream population, but also amongst Indigenous populations. Girls are still much more at risk in terms of STDs and HIV infection. And there remain many social inequalities around wages, around life in general. I also work in a number of other countries. I have been working in Kenya, Rwanda, Ethiopia, South Africa, Russia, where there are also many social inequalities, and so that particularly in relation to girls and young women. So the question of how to get at those voices or to how to hear what the voice of young women as knowers becomes a very critical piece. But there's another part, and I underlined the word actors today, because I think in the work that many of us who've been working in participatory methodologies to get at the knowers, the knowing side of things, we have perhaps been less successful at understanding or deepening an understanding of what it means to act. And what is the notion of acting? And so I think it's a different question, both knowers and actors. And that's how I've come to think about this notion of public voice and why it is so important. The notion of voice itself is arguably in participatory research, where you are trying to get at the voices of knowers, possibly the most overused and understudied question, and I have really just tried to problematize it. I am drawing from the research of many different scholars, and I haven't referenced them all here, but voice. Do youth, for example, really have a voice? What does voice mean? Whose agenda is it? Can adults give voice? Can anybody give voice to someone else? We often talk about, oh, I gave voice to these people to render their views. But who can give voice to someone? And of course, for people who are interested in the notion of the subaltern, who's listening? Yes, there is voice, but is there anybody out there, and voice for what? And so I think these are questions that should preoccupy us. They preoccupy our politicians all the time, and perhaps I am more sensitive to this. We have a federal election in Canada in 11 days, but we have to get at the voices of youth. But typically it is the Conservative Party who wants to know the voices of conservative youth, or perhaps in Sweden that it's the Social Democratic Party that wants to know the voice of social democratic youth. And so this notion of perhaps using youth and the voices of youth in ways, and girls and young women, in ways that perhaps are not all that genuine. They are a certain sense of somebody's voice. So I've tried to begin to problematize that more and think about why voice is important, but also why we need to critique voice. But then also to perhaps think about, well, what is public voice anyway? And I will not be able to offer all of the definitions that are out there, but I think one by Levine, who's done a lot of work in media and youth, talks about a public voice being one that can persuade other people beyond the closest friends and family to take action on shared issues. This may be a contentious view of public voice, but it suggests something beyond personal expression and beyond into some sort of a persuasion. But perhaps it is different for girls and young women. And what do we need? What do we know about that? Are the voices of girls and young women different? Are there different types of public voices? And so in the larger project that I'm working on, and I will just give you a couple of case studies this morning, what is the public voice of girls and young women? Is there some type of support that adults can offer to develop an agenda and sustain an agenda around public voice, of persuading, taking up social issues? Are there lessons that we can learn from interventions that are already underway about what is public voice? And perhaps at the end you will say, are there cautionary notes too? Are there some things that there are potential dangers when we think about public voice in relation to speaking out about issues of feminism, gender violence, and other areas that may in themselves be very dangerous to public voice? And what is the role of adults, and what are the roles of researchers in perhaps either being complicit or in some way critiquing this work? So what I really just want to do is take a look at a couple of case studies. I probably only look at 2, but I ambitiously think I will talk about 3. But Andreas will stop me. So these are just some beginnings of some case studies where we're trying to look at cross work that I'm doing in different countries and with different research teams. So I will talk a little bit about a case study in Canada, one in Vietnam, and if there is time, I will definitely reference the work that we've been doing in South Africa. The first example comes from Canada, but it could just as easily be conducted here in Sweden. And that is in relation, and you do not, I have determined, necessarily have to have ethical consent to do this, to study public voice in the public domain. And so a group of researchers that I'm working with from Brock University and the University of Quebec have been looking at video blogs or vlogs. These are short YouTube videos that are produced, well, as we know, there are millions of topics and issues covered on YouTube, but there's a particular genre of video blogs that are typically produced. There are many of them on social issues, if you want to study social issues. They typically are one person speaking, typically in a monologue style. Now I'm thinking perhaps I'm doing a vlog, but I'm not. Okay. They're typically filmed in the domestic space where the young person lives. They're typically in a range of topics, and they almost always are, hello, my name is, and I want to talk to you about this pressing issue of. And what we've discovered is there are a number of young people who have their own channels. We've been following a young woman called Sabrina, and we've been looking at these. They're usually like 3 minutes long, and she has one called "Why I Need Feminism." But there are vlogs on environmental issues. There are vlogs on sexual harassment. You can, for any issue. We've been doing work around Indigenous young people as well. And what has been interesting is to see how do people address audience. I think probably it might be true in both Sweden and Canada that we all learned how to write the persuasive essay in high school or in junior high school, where we try to convince someone of something with argumentation and refutation and so on. And in a way, these vlogs, these video blogs are, I would think, like the 21st century digital reincarnation of the compelling, persuasive essay, because the person who is producing the vlog wants to convince people why this is a good argument about feminism or about the environment or about social issues. So how do we study that? Where do people learn that? How do people engage in audience? How do young people hold audience? How do they hold contradictory views? Because that's also another aspect of argument. And what are the arguments? So we have been following several of these channels to try to look at what are the rhetorical styles, how do people maintain their audience, what can we learn about how people position themselves in the world of public voice. And it's a genre and a platform that I think that we could study to try to understand what does that mean and how do young people gain that knowledge. This is entirely, I have to say, DIY. It's do it yourself. It's not taught in most, I don't know any schools that teach vlogs. Young people are learning it from each other and taking up that particular digital social media space. What does it mean? How does it work? What can we learn? The second example, the second case study comes out of work that we've been doing in Vietnam with girls with disability. Girls and young women with disability in both local and global contexts are probably one of the most discriminated and excluded groups in the world. Highest rates of sexual violence, highest rates of exclusion, of bullying, in many places denial of educational rights, and even if girls do have the right to go to school, can they get into the school in terms of access? Highest rates of domestic violence, lowest rates of literacy, even when you have boys and girls with the same types of impairments, whether they are visual, whether they are intellectual, whether they are cognitive in some way, that girls are much less likely to have access to schooling and to stay in school or to have good schooling. So to try to think about, well, what would public voice look like amongst an extremely marginalized group? And of course, I don't have to remind us of the situation in Vietnam from 4 decades ago and perhaps how the Western imperialism was also part of what we are now experiencing in Vietnam today. So I've been working with several colleagues from Vietnam and several NGOs that are made up of women with disability who are working in a participatory way with girls with disability. And we, in the bottom corner, those of you who are involved in Photovoice projects will recognize a group who are, about to take photographs of how they feel excluded in school. That was the prompt that they were working with. And that was their idea of knowing. How do we get at the knowing aspect, but then how do we get at the acting aspect? And what has been very interesting as we've been working with the group over a period of time is to sort of see how the girls themselves wanted to have a public voice. They didn't want to just exhibit their pictures for each other. They didn't just want to talk about what are the issues. They wanted to show the issues to policymakers. They wanted to figure out ways where they could have voice in their words. So in the top picture, the public voice there is presenting some of their recommendations to a group of policymakers. So they use digital media to produce the images, but the policies and the problems they wanted to talk about, they presented in a more conventional way. They also learned about making policy posters. And if you will look at the extreme left side, it's an example of a poster that the girls created using their photographs, but again, making recommendations. The recommendation is listen to what disabled people say. The recommendation is that schools should eliminate discrimination and give us more support to be fully included. So the idea of their speaking out was a very, very, very critical part of a type of public voice. Who's your audience? What would be the most compelling medium to do this? And it was very interesting when we talk about public voice and collective action that they wanted to do it in groups. They didn't want to present by themselves. They wanted to be in a group. And so perhaps public voice of girls and young women is perhaps a collective action. So again, thinking about what can we learn as we go along. The third case study since Andres hasn't stood up yet, is to think about the work that we've been doing in South Africa. And some of you I know in this building have had access to looking at an exhibition that was produced about a group of young women at Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University who were speaking out against the rape culture and sexual violence on campus, which is something that we could just as easily have presented from a Canadian university context. They produced cell film videos where they were talking about what the issues were and how they saw them. But again, their knowing was exhibited in their photos and in their cell films. And as researchers, we could say, oh, we can see a different aspect of these issues. But what they also wanted to do was talk to policymakers. So we have many pictures. You saw many of those of you who have been outside Katya's office will see lots of photographs of how this exhibition translated into a meaning making for reaching publicly people who need to know about these issues. And so again, the digital was a very important part of producing and coming up with the knowing. The acting, the public voice, would be to begin to learn how does one do that? What are the strategies? How do we reach different publics? Who are the publics? When is it a youth? When is it our peers? When is it policymakers? When is it government? And that type of public voice is something that is perhaps we don't just acquire it. Some of us never acquire it, but the idea of being strategic is something that I think we're seeing in these last two projects that are not do-it-yourself. They were part of an adult-oriented initiative, but translated into how can we take action or become actors. Well, what are we learning? These are just 3 case studies, and I'm being very brief. I would be happy to talk further, of course. But I think some of the things that the notion of a blurring of the boundaries between do-it-yourself and adult-oriented and adult-initiated projects, I think is really interesting. We sometimes think we shouldn't touch youth's voice at all, or we should only work with youth. And I think we're seeing that these things, there is a blurring of the boundaries. I use the term social activism in my title. I'm not sure by the time as we work on this further, we think, is it really social activism? Is it actually social change oriented? Is that the term? Is it taking action? Is it an activist agenda? But I think it maybe compels us to think differently about what language we use and what would be the best way to talk about it. We might also think about different strategies. I've mentioned online platforms. I've also talked about action briefs or policy posters. The young women in South Africa also produced action briefs. So are there different tactics that can be taught? Are these pieces that can be learned within social movements? And then finally, how do we as researchers refine the tools? I've talked about trying to study online platforms. How do we study these differently? It seems that the complexity of this work around choice making it is complex, but we're also seeing young women trying to change the world. And so how do we as researchers look at that? And how do we refine this notion of public voice? Its voice is problematic, public voice is problematic, but how do we actually do this? I think as we look through these studies, I think I started with the question, what would it look like to study the world from the standpoint of knowers and actors? I think we see whole programs in political science and media and communications studying what our politicians do. We have endless tapes on how Kennedy won the primaries or how Obama's speeches in our own elections. We know everything about Stephen Harper, our prime minister's hair, and the significance to political success. And it seems to me that the kinds of attention that we've paid to political voice of public leaders needs to also be diverted into thinking about this notion of public voice of leaders who are already leading in their own way. One of my colleagues at McGill, Aziz Chaudhry, has a new book called Learning Activism, The Intellectual Life of Contemporary Social Movements. And it's an interesting take on social movements, but I think I would like to suggest going one step further in terms of thinking of the kinds of movements that I've referred to in this particular piece. So I just want to end by saying that we talk a lot, I think, in the work around sexual violence in particular, about how young women and girls lose voice. But we don't talk enough about this notion of reaching out, reaching and gaining space and reaching out. And one of the young women in the South African project commented recently, what I am now as a young woman who is well on her way to making my own and other young women's voices heard will hopefully enlighten. So then she says, and that's all I want to say. So that's all I want to say too. So thank you very much. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Are there any questions, remarks?
Yes.
Thank you, Claudia. It was very interesting. I was just wondering a bit about, I liked your talk about problematizing voice, and the idea about who is listening. And I think could you say something about who is listening? Is there different target groups using the different kinds of methods? Who is listening to the vlogs and who is listening to the action briefs?
Yeah. A good one. I mean, it actually goes back to the question, I guess, about who young people or who anyone is trying to persuade, because even trying to find the vlogs on feminism or on environmental issues, you have to practically become an FBI or a CSI person to track these down. So it's actually quite interesting. I think it perhaps changes the notion of where persuasion most needs to be looked at. I mean, we think of it in terms of policy making and policy and community leaders, but we also know about social movements that young people talking to young people. So I think we've actually been very interested in studying what is it that prompts other young people to respond to these vlogs. So I don't really, the question, of course, is the question about influence. But I think it maybe begs us to think about influence not only in studying up or influencing up in relation to elites and governments and ministries and so on, but also this notion of studying outward and what does it really mean to have a social movement amongst young people? So I guess that's where I would also like us to think about how we do that, and to try to look at both ways. And why I think the face-to-face was perhaps more influential with policymakers at Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University. I don't think they would watch vlogs or know what to do with them or say likes or not likes. They might, but I think that the notion of the personal perhaps there was the more potent. But for other social groups, I think the social media is very significant. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think that we will stop there since we're running out of time here. So I would like to hand over a gift here from Mid-Sweden University. Thank you.